I want to talk about making yourself poor in an effort to reach financial independence, and not in the way that you might be thinking, where you are super frugal and you don't spend any money on all these unnecessary things, or you make huge cuts to your budget. And sure, that's one way to make a lot of progress in reaching financial independence. But I want to talk about a sort of different side of that same coin, which is where you make sure that you get all of the money that would be coming into your account into a particular place so that you can't use it for discretionary spending. This is something that I'm really trying to focus on right now. I'm making more money than I ever have in any other point in my life. Now that I've graduated law school, I'm working as an attorney. I no longer have to be part-time and limiting my income that way. So I have a nice full-time income now. But I don't want to get tempted in using this money for things that I don't need or that aren't productive towards my financial independence goal. And that's very hard to do when you're stressed out with other things, whether it be running a YouTube channel on the side, whether it be your actual job itself. It can be very tempting to just put all the money into a pile and then use it for anything that isn't actually productive towards your overarching financial goal. So the way to do that, at least the way I do it, is I make it as though I don't have that money to use for anything that I want on a discretionary spending budget or something like that. Because if your money's sitting in a checking account, for example, it's as though you have this giant pile of liquidity that you can use towards whatever you want, because that is what it is. It's cash that you can use for anything. And if you don't have it assigned to a particular purpose, or more importantly, I would say, if you don't have it outside of that checking account and invested into something or used towards debt pay down to where you can no longer use that money, at least nearly as easily as before, that is a hindrance in that you're going to be very tempted to use it. Because it's very different when you say, we really don't have the cash to make this purchase, or yeah, we do have the cash right here, but now we have to force ourselves to take that little extra step to not spend it, even though it's totally spendable. It's right there. There's no extra hoops to jump through to actually spend that money. And that's what's so tempting about it. So making yourself poor really refers to taking that money out of that checking account immediately and moving it into something with a purpose, whether it be into a stock portfolio, into a real estate deal, into debt pay down, into something that gets it out of your hands, or at least out of sight, to where you can't actually access it nearly as easily as before. You'd have to sell off your stocks. You'd have to take out margin or something like that to access that money again. If you didn't want to sell the piece of real estate, you're going to have to sell the piece of real estate, do a refinance or something. It's much harder to get that money. And there are risks associated with that, of course. But if your goal is to supercharge your investing and to reach financial independence as quickly as possible, then that's probably the approach you want to consider taking, especially while you're in that early stage of the grind. And maybe your spending hasn't caught up with your new income as it continues to grow, as you get better at your job, as you build your business, whatever it is. So you don't want to give your spending a chance to actually catch up with your income. That's the kind of struggle that everyone goes through. Lifestyle inflation, we've all heard of it. As our incomes grow, it's very tempting to spend that income if you don't assign it and are very intentional about getting it out of sight, out of mind, essentially, to where it's actually put to work. That money is as good as gone, even though it is doing something productive in an investable asset, whatever it is. It's the whole point of getting that money out of your hands so that you don't have to put the mental energy towards not spending it, because that is arguably much more difficult than actually using the mental energy to spend it. It's a lot easier to spend than it is to not spend, at least for most people. If you're extremely cheap, you might be able to do this pretty easily, but at that point, you're probably not taking many risks in investments anyway. So I don't know if you're really going for financial independence. It might just be some sort of weird disposition you might have. Just reconsider that carefully if that's what you're going for. If you're just trying to save money for the sake of saving money, that's not very productive, I would say, and often is more harmful because of the negative stigma attached to it. Not that you should go out and spend all your money, but just consider your options. I'm really referring to taking the money that you have and putting it to work right away so that you can't do the work yourself in whittling down that pile of cash, spending money on unnecessary things, or maybe even things that you think you could need and might actually be decently productive, but you could be putting it immediately to use in a more productive thing that is actually aligned with your goals here and now. You can get those bigger things later down the line, maybe a nicer car, a nicer personal residence that's not a house hack, that's not otherwise going to be turned into a rental. That's what I'm doing with this place here that I just moved into. this is a long-term rental that I just so happen to be living in the first year because that's what the terms of my loans say. And that's how I got access to really good owner-occupied financing. And I'm putting all that cash to work. I'm not trying to have a massive pile of cash sitting around, at least not yet. It just doesn't make a lot of sense in my view because I'm in a growth phase. And me parking cash on the side not only is tempting to spend it, but then it's not really being used productively, or at least as productively as it could be if it was in an asset. But since I'm fully invested outside of that, it's much more difficult for me to pull on new cash to take advantage of a sort of flash situation, a investment opportunity that might not be there for very long. I'll miss out on that opportunity, or at least I wouldn't be able to take advantage of it that much because I'd have a limited ability to pull liquidity down to actually make that particular investment. But I'm at the stage now where my portfolio isn't that humongous anyways relative to my income, and I want to keep earning new income to build up that portfolio so that when I do make investment moves, and that is another thing to consider. If your portfolio is, say, a year's worth of your income or less, it's probably not going to make much of a difference in the grand scheme of things because in a year's time, you're going to earn back the whole value of your portfolio anyways, unless you get some home run investment that multiplies your portfolio many times over, but those are rare as it is. So no guarantees that that's going to happen. But if your portfolio goes up 10 or 20% in that time, that's nice and helpful, but it's not as helpful as actually just adding a ton of new money to the portfolio that year and doubling it that way. Eventually, returns will outweigh the actual capital contributions that you're making, but that takes some time to get to. And again, that's discounting the fact that you could have a home run investment that totally catapults the returns of the portfolio, even while it's pretty small and actually can move the needle quite a bit. But some particular ways that I try to make myself poor in an effort to actually become wealthy is that I have most of my money go into accounts automatically that have very specific purposes. So for example, you have your basic retirement accounts, your 401k, your IRAs, the HSA that I use for my healthcare, that is all automatic, and that's something like 10 to 15% of my total income. That goes in there, tax advantaged, and just taking care of my long-term future, at least ideally, so long as all goes well. That is sort of my safety net plan. That's all taken care of. So there goes 15% or so of my income right there. And of course, there's tax withholding, so I'm not really counting that. That's also taken out of your income automatically with a W-2 job. If you're a 1099 worker or you're self-employed to where you actually have to withhold taxes yourself, your employer's not doing it, then you got to do that automatically as well. You better make sure that you do that. That's another chunk potentially. But then beyond that, I have specific accounts for stocks. Most of my money right now is actually going towards a margin account on one of my stock portfolios because I used that margin to take advantage of the real estate deal that I am now living in. I used that to cover the down payment and some rehab costs. And now that my new income's coming in, I'm using that to pay down the margin right away. So I could do the same again. But meanwhile, all of the cash that I would have otherwise had to sell off from the portfolio to use towards the deal, that remained invested. I didn't trigger any tax sales that way since it's just pulling out debt against your assets, which is not a taxable event, at least yet. We'll see what happens in the future. But the best part was that I had the liquidity there, even though it wasn't in cash, it was all invested. I had the liquidity via that margin loan to then use it to pay for the real estate deal that I just bought. So I still had the liquidity there, but it's different than having a pile of cash because when you have just a giant pile of cash sitting there that's totally in sight and maybe very much in mind as you're going about spending on your daily things, when that pile of cash is there, it's very different than having to go through the extra step of pulling out margin, which is added risk. I don't want to use debt on something that's not going to be paying me in the long run because that is where you can run into trouble very, very quickly. Not to say that there aren't extra risks with using it towards things that do pay you, because there's always a chance that you won't be paid by some asset, like a piece of real estate. It goes vacant for a while and you didn't have enough reserves. That's risk when you have debt. So it's not as though debt is indestructible when it is quote unquote good debt, but bad debt, especially that's just objectively bad. You're using debt to pay for a vacation or pay for some luxury item that's not going to actually get you anything in return. And while it's great to live now, you got to really weigh your options carefully there. So point is, when I have it tied up in stocks or some other asset, I have to go through the extra step of pulling out margin. And I don't want to use margin towards things that aren't going to actually produce a greater return for my portfolio while I'm in this growth phase. But I think the overarching lesson here is a sort of balance between automation and then also creating barriers that are productive towards your financial goals. And what I mean by that is with automation, you have money automatically going to certain accounts or portfolios as much as possible so that you don't actually have to make any sort of decision towards it. It's all done for you. You make the decision once and then it automatically happens after that. But creating barriers or at least some inconveniences to access that money also helps to prevent you from spending it frivolously on things that you don't need, or overspending for something that, again, you don't need, or might make something into a bad deal just because you say, hey, I got the cash here, so I'll overpay for this particular asset, this real estate deal, this whatever it is, because I have the cash here. Whereas if you invested it, you weigh your decisions very carefully, or at least more carefully than you would otherwise if you have to do something like pull out margin or do some other barrier there to actually get the money back out. So that's what I mean by making yourself poor. When you're actually increasing your net worth and you're building your financial future, even though it feels like you don't actually have the money there because, well, you don't have the money easily accessible. It's going towards whatever productive use that actually factors into your goals. It seems like we're in a constant battle with our short-term psychology. So as much as you can make your environment long-term focused by removing the money in the short term, I think that can only help you for the future. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't live a little and enjoy life for what it offers, because there's lots of great things associated with spending money on things that you like, but trying to control that by removing the money quickly before you actually have a chance to spend it on something that you don't really want or that really isn't that important to you, I think that is a very useful step towards building that financial future and getting towards financial independence or whatever financial goal it really is. Anyways, I should probably wrap this up before I get too rambly. So if you like this video, definitely like it, since that would help the channel out a lot. And if you like this sort of content about investing and personal finance, then definitely have a look around the channel. I put up new videos every single week about those topics. So if you like that sort of content, be sure to subscribe.